My manager tried to silence me with a non-disclosure agreement, so I used Clause 14 that he never read. The conference room had no windows. I sat across from Mark Ellison, my manager, watching his face turn red as he slammed the NDA folder onto the table. Pens jumped. Claire from HR flinched but said nothing. Mark's finger stabbed toward me like a weapon. "You've compromised this company," he said through clenched teeth. I hadn't said a word. Not one. My chest felt tight like someone was pressing down on my ribs. My palms were ice cold against my lap. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, too bright, making everything feel exposed and raw. Mark pushed the papers toward me, sliding them across the fake wood surface until they touched my frozen hands. "Sign it. Today. Or you're done here." I stared at the signature line. Black ink. Official company letterhead. My name typed underneath in perfect corporate font. My hand wanted to shake, but I forced it still. Something inside me broke in that moment. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just cleanly. Quietly. Like ice cracking under pressure you can't see. The break felt permanent. My breath came out shaky as I whispered to myself what felt like the truth. My name is Kelly Abrams, and 20 minutes before this moment, I still believed I had a future here. The memory hit me hard. 20 minutes ago, I'd been standing in front of the entire creative team. Mark had called an emergency meeting. Everyone gathered around the conference table, laptops open, coffee cups steaming. I thought he wanted to discuss the campaign launch. Instead, he'd smiled that cruel smile I'd started recognizing over the past few months. "Kelly made some errors in judgment," he'd announced casually, like he was commenting on the weather. "The Anderson pitch. That failure falls on her shoulders. My presentation. My research. My strategy." He'd taken it all, presented it as his own to the client, botched the details I'd perfected, then blamed me for his mistakes. Everyone had stared. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked away. Nobody said anything. That's when everything started sliding off the cliff. The client pitch had been 3 days ago. I remembered every terrible second. I'd been mid-sentence, explaining the consumer psychology research behind our campaign approach, when Mark cut me off. "Actually, let me clarify what Kelly's trying to say," he'd interrupted smoothly. Then he'd presented my work as if he'd created it himself. He changed key details I'd spent weeks perfecting. He misrepresented the data. He confused the timeline. When the client asked follow-up questions, he couldn't answer them properly because he didn't understand the research. The client had frowned, confused by the inconsistencies. Mark had turned to me with fake concern. "Kelly, I think your lack of clarity here is causing problems." My face had burned red while everyone watched. The client shifted uncomfortably. Mark played the victim, sighing like he was disappointed in me. Like he was trying so hard to help me succeed, but I kept letting him down. "She's slipping lately," he'd told the client, shaking his head sadly. Later that day, I'd hidden in the stairwell. Nobody used the stairs. It was the only place I could breathe without someone watching. I sat on the cold concrete steps, replaying every moment. The way Mark had smiled. The way he'd stolen credit. The way he'd made me look incompetent in front of a major client. That's when I realized something terrifying. Mark hadn't made a mistake. This wasn't an accident or miscommunication. He'd planned this. He'd deliberately sabotaged me, stolen my work, then blamed me for the failure he'd caused. The realization felt like falling. But sitting there in that empty stairwell, I made a decision. I would not break publicly. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry or panic or fall apart. Not for him. Not for anyone who watched it happen and said nothing. I wiped my face, stood up, and walked back to my desk with my head high. The next morning I went to get coffee from the break room. 2 co-workers stood by the machine, whispering. They didn't see me approach from the hallway. Their voices carried through the doorway. "Did you hear about Kelly tanking the Anderson pitch?" "I know. Mark had to step in and save it. She's lucky he's so patient with her." I stopped walking. My fingernails pressed into my palms hard enough to leave crescent-shaped marks in my skin. My coffee mug felt heavy in my hand. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Could have walked in. Could have corrected them. Could have told them the truth. Instead, I turned around silently and went back to my desk. I said nothing. But I remembered their names. I remembered exactly what they'd said. I remembered that Mark had planted these lies deliberately, knowing they'd spread like poison through the office. He was controlling the narrative, making sure everyone believed his version before I could defend myself. That afternoon HR called me in. The tone was already wrong when I walked through the door. Cold. Neutral. Professional in that way that means they've already made up their minds. Mark had filed a performance concern about me. I sat down and explained everything. Calmly. Carefully. I laid out the facts about the Anderson pitch. About my research. About Mark changing details and misrepresenting my work. About him blaming me for his mistakes. They nodded like they were listening. But nobody wrote anything down. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Nobody seemed surprised. "We'll look into it," they said in that tone that means they won't. I left the room knowing the truth. The decision had been made long before I arrived. They'd already chosen to believe Mark. My explanation was just a formality they had to complete for legal purposes. I was being set up for termination. And everyone in that room already knew it. The weekly team meeting happened 2 days later. Mark sat at the head of the table like always. His coffee mug positioned just right. His smile easy and confident. He started by praising his favorites. The underqualified hires he'd brought in over the past year. People he treated like disciples who worshipped him. "Brandon, excellent work on the social media analysis," Mark said warmly. Brandon beamed. The analysis had been basic at best. "Jessica, your presentation skills are really developing." Jessica had stumbled through her last 3 presentations. Mark threw out compliments like scraps to hungry dogs. His favorites ate them up, grateful for his attention. Then I watched something that made my stomach turn. Mark put his hand on Brandon's shoulder while laughing at something he said. Brandon's body went stiff. His smile looked forced. For just a second I saw fear in his eyes. That's when I understood completely. This was how Mark maintained control. He chose who thrived and who got sacrificed. He kept everyone desperate for his approval. Back in the windowless conference room, I forced myself to focus. Mark and Claire watched me stare at the NDA. They expected me to panic, to sign immediately out of fear. Instead, I flipped to the final pages. My eyes scanned the dense legal text quickly. Most of it was standard. Confidentiality clauses. Non-disparagement agreements. Legal threats dressed up in corporate language. Then I saw it. Clause 14. Recipient may request full documentation of resource allocation pertaining to disputed responsibilities prior to agreement enforcement. My pulse stopped. I read it again to make sure I understood. If I formally requested it, they had to legally hand over all project assignments, budget trails, credit logs, everything documenting who did what work, including Mark's falsified records. The clause was buried deep in the document. Mark clearly never read this far. He probably had the legal team draft it and just signed off without reviewing. I didn't react. Kept my face neutral. I hid the spark igniting in my chest. I lifted my eyes slowly and gave Mark the smallest, calmest smile. Threw him completely off balance. His confident expression faltered. He'd expected tears, fear, begging, maybe anger he could use against me. Instead, I said quietly, "I'll need a day to review this thoroughly." Mark's face went red. "That's not, we need this signed today. The document itself says I have 48 hours to review before signing," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I'd like to exercise that right." Claire from HR shifted uncomfortably. She knew I was correct. The NDA did say that. "This is ridiculous," Mark snapped. "You're making this difficult for no reason." "I just want to be thorough," I said simply. Claire reluctantly agreed I could take a day. Mark looked like he wanted to explode. He grabbed his folder and stormed out without another word. I stood up calmly, picked up the NDA, and walked out of that room steady as stone. That night, I spread all the NDA pages across my kitchen table. My apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I made tea and sat down with a notebook and pen. Then I started creating a meticulous checklist. Cross-reference old emails about project assignments. Document every instance of Mark taking credit for my work. Find witnesses who saw what really happened. Gather proof of timeline inconsistencies in his version of events. Request formal documentation under Clause 14. I wasn't planning revenge. Revenge was emotional and messy and unfocused. I was building a blueprint. Systematic, factual, undeniable case. I worked until 2 a.m, organizing everything I could remember from the past 6 months. Every stolen presentation. Every falsified report. Every time Mark had blamed me for his failures. When I finally went to bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. The next morning I called Trina. Trina had worked in our department 2 years ago before transferring to another division. We'd stayed friendly. She was one of the few people I trusted. We met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office. Trina looked nervous the moment she sat down. "I heard about what's happening," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry." I told her about the NDA. About Mark's false accusations. About Clause 14. Trina went pale. "Kelly, I need to tell you something," she whispered, looking around to make sure nobody was listening. "When I worked under Mark, he pressured me to adjust reporting logs. He wanted to make it look like he'd done more work than he actually had. I was scared to refuse. My heart pounded. "Do you still have copies?" "On my personal backup drive," she admitted. "I kept them because something felt wrong. But I've been too terrified to say anything. If I formally invoke Clause 14, would you share them?" Trina hesitated. Fear flickered across her face. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes. If it's official and legal, yes." The first puzzle piece slid into place. I returned to the office that afternoon with a neutral expression. Mark was already back at his desk. He watched me walk past but didn't say anything. His favorites whispered among themselves, throwing glances my way. Claire from HR tracked my movements like I was a grenade with the pin pulled. I sat down, opened my laptop, and composed a formal email. Subject: Clause 14 documentation request. NDA review. I kept the tone professional and calm. I cited the exact clause number and requested all documentation related to project assignments, budget allocations, and credit attribution for the past 18 months. I sent it to HR and copied the legal compliance department. Then I waited. Within an hour, Claire appeared at my desk. Her face was tight. "This is highly unusual," she said. "It's my legal right under the agreement you presented," I replied calmly. She walked away without responding. Mark suddenly had a closed-door meeting that lasted 2 hours. They knew what Clause 14 meant. Mark clearly didn't. The next morning, Mark called me into his office. His tone started friendly, almost charming. He leaned back in his chair and smiled like we were old friends having a casual chat. "Kelly, I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday," he said smoothly. "Let's just move forward. Sign the NDA, and we can all put this behind us." I said nothing. His smile faded slightly. He tried a different approach. "You know, making waves right now won't help your career," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "People remember troublemakers." Still I stayed silent. His mask cracked. He leaned forward, his face hardening. "What exactly are you trying to prove here?" I met his eyes and smiled softly. Truth has a way of proving itself. The color drained from his face. For the first time since this started, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. 3 days later, HR reluctantly handed over the documents. Boxes of them. Printed emails. Project logs. Budget reports. Timesheets. Everything I'd requested under Clause 14. I took them home and spent the entire weekend reviewing every single page. Line by line. Timestamp by timestamp. Lie by lie. I found misreported hours where Mark claimed credit for work I'd done. I found reallocated budgets where he'd shifted resources to make his projects look more successful. I found project theft documented in his own emails, where he'd taken my strategies and presented them as his own ideas. His signature was on everything. My chest tightened as the full picture emerged. This wasn't just about me. Mark had been doing this systematically for years. To multiple people. Building his reputation by stealing from the people beneath him. This wasn't just unprofessional behavior. This was fraud. I compiled everything into a clean, organized portfolio. No accusations. No emotional language. No angry commentary. Just data. Timestamps. Documents. Evidence. I created a timeline showing exactly what happened with the Anderson pitch. I included my original presentation files with creation dates. I showed Mark's version with later timestamps. I documented his email where he'd assigned himself as lead without telling me. I included the client's feedback that contradicted Mark's claims. Then I submitted it formally to HR with a simple cover letter. I copied the compliance department because the NDA gave me every legal right to do so. Mark had thought he was silencing me with that agreement. Instead, he'd handed me the match that would burn down his carefully constructed lies. I hit send and felt something like justice beginning to take shape. The atmosphere in the office changed overnight. Mark's favorites started noticing something was wrong. He snapped at Brandon over a minor mistake. He cancelled his usual Thursday lunch with Jessica. He locked himself in his office for hours at a time. The easy confidence he always wore like armor was cracking. His disciples began whispering among themselves. Something was off. Their leader was scared. Is Mark in trouble? I heard someone ask in the break room. What did Kelly do? Another voice responded. I pretended not to hear. I kept my head down and focused on my actual work. But I felt their eyes on me constantly now. The whispers followed me through the hallways. The dynamic was shifting. People were starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they'd believed the wrong person. 1 week after I submitted my documentation, a compliance officer arrived. His name was Thomas Wright. He wore a gray suit and carried a leather briefcase. He didn't announce himself or send an email first. He just appeared in our department at 9 in the morning. Mark was escorted from his desk for questioning. I watched from across the office as Mark's face went white. He grabbed his phone and folder. He looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. His eyes found mine across the room. I met his gaze without flinching, without anger, without satisfaction, just steady and calm. Mark looked away first. His shoulders hunched as Thomas led him toward the executive conference room. The entire office had gone silent. Everyone stared. Someone's phone buzzed. The sound felt deafening in the quiet. By the end of that day, Mark was placed on immediate suspension. The email came from the executive team at 4:30 in the afternoon. Due to ongoing compliance review, Mark Ellison has been temporarily suspended pending investigation. The office exploded into whispered conversations. People clustered in groups, speculating wildly. Some looked shocked. Others looked vindicated, like they'd suspected something was wrong all along. I packed up my things and left at exactly 5 o'clock. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked questions. This was where the story could have ended. Mark suspended. Me vindicated. Justice served. But the cracks in the foundation ran much deeper than anyone realized yet. The compliance audit expanded rapidly over the next 2 weeks. Thomas Wright brought in additional investigators. They interviewed employees from other departments. They pulled financial records going back 3 years. What they found went beyond my case. Mark's mentorship program that he'd bragged about in meetings, built on inflated numbers. He'd claimed credit for developing junior employees who'd actually been trained by other people. The budget successes he'd presented to executives, achieved by taking credit for other teams' work and misreporting his own spending. Then they found something worse. Brandon, Mark's favorite, had filed a quiet complaint 6 months ago about inappropriate behavior and pressure to falsify reports. HR had buried it. They'd never investigated, never followed up, never protected Brandon. The company suddenly had its own massive crisis to manage. 3 weeks after Thomas Wright first arrived, I was called into an executive review. This time the atmosphere was completely different. The executives actually listened. They asked thoughtful questions. They took detailed notes. They treated me with respect. I answered everything calmly, clearly, professionally. I showed them my original work and Mark's stolen versions. I explained the timeline of the Anderson pitch. I described the pattern of credit theft and blame shifting. I presented facts, not emotions. When I finished, the senior vice president leaned forward. "Ms. Abrams, we owe you an apology," he said seriously. "This should never have happened. We failed you." I nodded but said nothing. I was no longer prey waiting to be hunted. I was a professional stating facts that could no longer be ignored. Mark's suspension became termination. Publicly, officially, immediately. The company sent an all-staff email announcing his departure, due to violations of company policy and professional conduct standards. They announced a full department restructuring because of misconduct by previous leadership. Within days, Mark's name spread through the industry. Recruiters quietly removed him from candidate lists. His LinkedIn connections started disappearing. His professional reputation collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. Everything he'd built on lies and stolen work vanished almost overnight. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, no joy. Just a quiet sense that the truth had finally been allowed to speak. 2 days after Mark's termination, the executives called me in again. They offered me Mark's old position, department head, his office, his salary, his authority. I sat there feeling the weight of the moment. Promotion, recognition, power, everything I might have wanted 6 months ago. But sitting in that room, I realized something important. I didn't want it. Not here. Not in the place that had watched me drown and done nothing until forced to act. Not in the building where HR had buried complaints and protected someone like Mark until they had no other choice. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully. "But I need to decline." They looked surprised, maybe even offended. But I'd already made my decision. I gave my official 2 weeks' notice that afternoon. Professional to the last second. I documented everything for whoever would replace me. I finished my current projects. I trained the junior staff on processes they'd need. Mark's office sat empty now. Nobody had moved in yet. Sometimes I walked past and looked at the space where he used to sit, planning his next theft or blame shift. The air felt lighter somehow, like a pressure had lifted. My last day arrived on a Friday. I packed my personal items into a small box. Family photos, plant, the coffee mug my best friend had given me. I walked out of the building into the parking lot. Sunlight warmed my face. The air smelled like rain coming. I felt like I was breathing properly for the first time in years. A woman unburied. My new job started the following Monday. A competitor had reached out 2 weeks earlier after hearing about the compliance audit through industry connections. They wanted someone with my skills. Someone with integrity. Someone who wouldn't stay silent when things went wrong. The office was brighter. The people were kinder. My new boss valued my input and gave me credit for my ideas. Nobody stole my work. Nobody blamed me for their failures. Nobody tried to control me through fear. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And I realized something profound. My power hadn't come from taking Mark down. That was just truth finally being heard. My real power came from choosing myself. From refusing to be silenced. From knowing my worth even when others tried to diminish it. 6 months later, I sat in my new office overlooking the city. The view stretched for miles. The sky was clear blue. Everything felt possible in a way it hadn't for years. I thought about Mark sometimes. About that NDA he'd slammed on the table. About Clause 14 that he never bothered to read. He'd tried to silence me. Instead, he'd handed me exactly what I needed to expose him. He'd lost everything because he never believed someone like me could fight back. Because he'd built his entire career on underestimating people. But I didn't destroy Mark. I needed people to understand that. Mark destroyed himself. With his lies, his theft, his cruelty, his arrogance. I simply told the truth and let the facts speak for themselves. And then I chose a future where I don't shrink to fit someone else's comfort. Where I don't stay silent to make other people's lives easier. Where I remember my own worth even when others forget it. I smiled, small and genuine and earned. That smile belonged to me now. Nobody could take it away.